I have no voice. That is the first thing you should understand about me. And the last thing the Capitol expected to matter. They took my tongue 11 years ago, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and burned copper wire. They called it a procedure. The man who held my head still wore clean white gloves, and he did not look at my face while he worked. There was a ceiling panel with a water stain shaped like a bird above the table, and I looked at that panel the whole time, because looking at something far away is a thing you can do when you cannot leave. Afterward, they handed me a card that said AVOX in block letters and sent me back to the service corridors of the Capitol, where I spent the next decade carrying trays and sweeping floors and watching the powerful eat their imported food and discuss their schedules. I learned to read lips. I learned to read rooms. I learned that the people who talk the loudest rarely have anything to say, and that the people with the most to say are often the ones the powerful make sure cannot say it. I learned that the Capitol does not see furniture move. I learned to be very still. My brother Castor found me eventually. He was not an Avox. He had been careful or lucky, depending on which version of the story you believe. And he had built himself a life behind a camera lens in the years I spent in silence, documenting the spectacle the Capitol called entertainment. He was good at it, in the way people who genuinely love their work are good at it. Not because they are trying to be good, but because they cannot help it. Because the camera is the tool that lets do the thing they are actually built for. When the rebellion cracked open and the world came apart at its seams, Castor came to where they kept the Avoxes, and he found me and he brought me with him into the underground. He signed to me in the corridor of our first barracks on the morning we arrived, using the language we had built between us over years of my silence. She will need people who know how to watch. I did not argue. Watching is the only thing I have always done well, and after 11 years it had become something more than skill. It had become the particular gift of the person who has been made invisible. You see everything, because no one is performing for you. The woman who ran the operation, the one they called Coin, with the gray hair cut at a precise angle, and the gray eyes that seemed to have calculated the temperature of every room before she walked into it, and the voice that never went above a certain controlled pitch. She looked at me the first time we were introduced, and I saw her calculate my usefulness and file it somewhere behind her expression. She saw a man who could not speak, who would never accidentally say the wrong thing to a journalist, or a superior, or a potential defector, who could carry a camera through a war zone and keep his mouth shut afterward, because he had no other option. I was, in her terms, an asset. She filed me with the other assets and turned her attention to the more complicated problems. She was not wrong about me being useful. She was just wrong about what kind of useful. The girl's name was Katniss. She had survived 2 games, 2 separate iterations of the Capitol's most important ceremony, the one wherein children from the 12 subjugated districts were forced to kill each other in a constructed arena on live broadcast, while the Capitol watched and cheered and discussed the fashion choices of the tributes, as if the tributes were not children but characters in an entertainment product. The games had been running for 75 years. They had been designed by people who understood that horror, repeated and witnessed, eventually becomes normalized. That if you make people watch their children die long enough, they will begin to believe that this is the natural order of things, that this is what they deserve, that resistance is not a real possibility for people like them. Katniss had survived both times she was sent in. More than survived. She had made the Capitol look ridiculous. First, by threatening a joint suicide with the boy beside her, rather than killing him, which collapsed the game's entire narrative logic, and forced the Capitol to declare 2 winners for the first time in the program's history. And second, by being the person the rebels inside the arena had designed their whole extraction operation around. They hate ridicule more than anything, the Capitol people. More than rebellion, more than death, more than the loss of resources they consider strategic. Ridicule is the thing that cannot be managed after the fact, cannot be edited or reframed or bombed out of people's memories. It just sits there being ridiculous, permanently, in anyone who saw it happen. I met her in the underground complex. District 13. A place the capital had declared destroyed 40 years ago in the aftermath of a previous rebellion, which was a lie in the way that most capital declarations about the districts are lies, meaning it was true in some narrow literal sense and completely false in the sense that actually mattered. The district had gone underground. They had built deep into the bedrock and run their ventilation and their hydroponics and their power systems through a network of tunnels and chambers that the capital's aerial surveys had never identified, and they had waited. 40 years of waiting in the gray corridors and the recycled air, and now they were not waiting anymore. Complex sacks smelled of concrete and efficiency. Everyone wore the same gray clothing with their daily schedule printed on their forearm in black marker, because Coin's operation ran on the conviction that structure prevents the kind of chaos that gets people killed. And she was not wrong about this, only about how far you could take that principle before you started producing something other than order. There were rules about meal times and sleep periods, and the allocation of resources, and the rules were followed. And the result was a place that functioned, and that felt like it had had something essential removed from it, like the infrastructure of a town after all the people have left. Katniss did not fit. She was smaller than I expected. The broadcasts had made her seem larger. The Capitol's cameras always do that, inflate a person into a symbol, through the alchemy of angle and lighting and editorial choice. Puff them up until they are something you can project meaning onto. In person, she was a girl who moved like someone waiting to be hit, with the particular physical vocabulary of people who have learned that the environment is not reliably safe. There were shadows under her eyes that no amount of sleep was going to address, because they were not produced by sleep deprivation, but by the specific accumulated weight of things witnessed and survived, and not yet fully processed. She held her shoulders in a way I recognized from my years in the Capitol service corridors. The way people hold themselves when they are carrying something they cannot put down, even when given permission to rest. She had been through the kind of experience that rewrites a person's architecture from the inside. Not broken. She was not broken. I want to be clear about that, because the word is often used for people who have simply been changed, and change is not the same as damage, but rearranged. She had not yet located the new internal geography, had not yet walked all its rooms and found the doors. She was navigating by instinct in a space that was still unfamiliar to her. The man in charge of the media operation, Heavens be. A broad man with the rumpled energy of someone who has spent his life making things and has never quite managed to make himself look deliberate about it. He had a theory about her that I thought was correct from the first time I heard it stated. She cannot perform, he said in a meeting I attended as furniture. She needs to feel it first, and then she needs to let you see it while she is feeling it. In front of a camera in a studio, with lighting rigs and a script and a mark on the floor to stand on. And you get something technically competent and emotionally dead. Her where something real is happening and something real happens. On her face, and in her body, and the camera catches it, and there is no technology that exists in any district or in the capital itself that can manufacture that particular quality. I agreed with the theory. I had been watching her for 3 days by then, through the unintentional surveillance of an AVOX who is always in the room. The studio sessions were painful in the particular way of watching someone try to be something they are not structurally capable of being. Cressida, our director, a sharp woman with a vine tattoo curling from her left jaw up toward her hairline, who had defected from the Capitol's own filmmaking apparatus some time before the rebellion broke open, who had looked at what she was being asked to make and decided she would rather make something that was true. Cressida ran the sessions with professionalism and patience and got nowhere. Katniss stood on her mark in her new armor, the black suit the dead designer Cinna had created for her before the Capitol had taken him, which Coin's operation had reproduced from his notes as a piece of careful symbolism. And she said the lines Heavensby had written, and they were dead on arrival, not because the lines were bad, because she knew they were lines, and her body knew it, and her eyes knew it, and the camera will always find the gap between performance and fact. The camera is the most honest instrument humans have ever built, because it does not know how to not show what is actually there. After the second failed session, Cressida sat with me in the corridor outside and asked, in the loose sign approximation she had developed for our work conversations, "What does she need?" I considered the question carefully. I thought about 3 days of watching. I signed back. Something to be angry about that she did not choose to be angry about. Something that happens to her rather than something she is asked to produce. Cressida looked at her hands for a moment. Then she nodded. We went to District 8 4 days later. I want to try to describe the sensation of moving above ground after months in the underground complex, because it matters for understanding what happened. The sky hits you differently when you have spent a long time beneath it. Even a sky the color of old pewter, heavy with industrial cloud cover and carrying the faint bitter smell of smoke from fires that had been burning in the district for the better part of a week. Even that sky has a quality of openness, of verticality, that underground existence trains you to forget. The scale is wrong when you first emerge. Everything is too tall and too wide. And the wind moves in a way that feels like a message, in a language you have almost forgotten. I stood on the landing pad outside the hovercraft, and I looked up for a moment before Castor handed me the camera and I locked back into work. Because looking is not the same as filming, and we were here to film. District 8 was a textile district. Past tense, mostly, in the sense that the infrastructure of textile production was still physically present, but the production had largely stopped. Because most of the people who had operated it were now doing something else. The capital's bombardment of the district in the early weeks of the conflict had the effect that bombardment frequently produces in people who have nothing left to lose. It had converted them. Textile workers had become fighters, which is a type of conversion the capital's strategic planners had apparently not fully modeled. The hospital was in a converted factory. The ceilings were very high. Industrial ceilings, designed for the circulation of air over large machinery that was no longer there, the ghost of equipment still visible in the anchor points bolted to the concrete floor, and the grease stains and the electrical conduit that now terminated in nothing. The medical staff had hung supply bags from the structural beams and arranged the cots in rows, and done what was possible with what they had, which was considerable effort with insufficient materials. The people in those cots were people who had been badly hurt and were engaged in the business of continuing to exist, which is different from recovery in a controlled sense. There were people missing limbs. There were people with burns across significant portions of their bodies. There were people who were present physically and absent in some deeper sense, who had retreated to somewhere internal to wait out whatever was happening to them. Katniss walked into that room, and her face did the thing I had been watching for since I arrived in District 13. It opened. Not in the sense of the warm and steady expression that Heavensby had been coaching her toward in the studio. Not the performed version. Face opened the way a wound opens. Involuntarily, completely, without consultation with the person wearing it. The organized surface giving way entirely to what was underneath. She went cot to cot, and she held the hands that were extended to her. And she let people grip her arm with whatever force they still had available. And she said the words that were actually true, rather than the words she had been given to say. She said, "I'm sorry." She said, "I know." She said, to one woman with burns covering half her face, who reached up and touched the Mockingjay pin on Katniss's armor, and asked in a voice that was barely functional whether they were going to win. "I don't know. Think so. We have to." I filmed all of it. Kept the camera level, and my breathing controlled, and I filmed every moment, because this was real, is what we came for. And you do not pull back from real, even when the real is costing you something to witness. Cressida was moving on the other side of the room, doing the same thing. Masala was getting angles. Castor was covering the space between us. 4 people doing our jobs in a room full of suffering. And it is a strange thing to do your job in such a room, but the job is its own argument. The job says, this needs to be seen. This needs to be remembered. This happened, and the record of its happening is itself a form of resistance. Then the bombers came. I heard them before I saw them. Capital attack craft at high altitude produce a particular acoustic signature, a sustained mechanical pressure that you feel in the structure of your back teeth before your ears have fully processed the sound as sound. The effect is that you know something is wrong before you can name what it is. Around me the soldiers began moving, the ones whose entire function was protection and threat response, and their faces went flat in the way that trained people's faces go flat when training takes over from thought. Boggs, the officer assigned to keep Katniss alive, a large, quiet man with the unhurried movement of someone who has calculated precisely how much urgency each situation requires and never spends more than that. Boggs was already at her elbow, his mouth moving. She came out onto the rooftop. There were two capital aircraft, angular and fast, designed by people who think elegantly about the problem of destruction and have had significant resources to devote to the problem. They came in at altitude, and then tipped their noses down, and the ordnance began falling. And below us in the factory, the people in the cots did not have time to fully register what was happening before the structure began to come apart around them. There is nothing I can tell you about that part that does not sound inadequate. The sound was very loud. There was a quality to the concussive wave from the first impact that was different from the weapons test recordings I had heard in the complex. It had biological weight, the way sound only has weight when it is produced by something that does not care whether you are in its path. I kept filming. I want to be precise about this, because I have thought about it since, and I want you to understand the state I was in. Kept filming because it was my job, and because Cressida sees me filming, and because the record of this event was the only thing we were going to be able to bring back from it, the only currency with any value. But I also kept filming because my body was performing its function while my mind was somewhere behind it, trying to find a category for what I was witnessing and finding none available. I was still, and I was terrified, and I was doing my job. And these three things were all true simultaneously. Katniss was not still. She had her bow in her hands. I have watched the footage many times, and I cannot find the moment she drew it. One frame she is standing with her hands at her sides, and the next the bow is up and drawn. The arrow was the incendiary type, designed by the engineering division in District 13, the ones BT's team had been modifying with casings that increased the thermal effect on impact, crashing the first aircraft through its approach vector. And the aircraft was moving at speed on an angle that made a conventional arrow shot into a calculation most people with a bow would not attempt. And she was making the calculation, and I watched her face while she made it. 3, maybe 4 frames of footage. Absolute stillness. The anger underneath the surface, but the surface locked. Doing the mathematics of trajectory and speed and windage, solving the problem the way you solve a problem when you have been doing this particular type of calculations since you were old enough to hold the bow. She loosed. The arrow caught the first craft along its fuel intake housing, and the aircraft responded with a lateral yaw that aviation physics should not permit. And then the fire found what it needed, and the craft came out of the sky in a way that was loud and absolute and left a column of smoke over the landing perimeter. The second craft had already begun its adjustment, pulling up, banking to clear the debris field, and before it had completed the maneuver, she had the next arrow knocked and she loosed again, and this one went through the canopy, and the craft dropped straight down and hit the ground outside the factory perimeter, with a report that I felt in my sternum several fractions of a second before I heard it with my ears. The smoke from the factory was still rising, black and heavy, the specific character of smoke, from a structure that was burning from the inside. She turned to the cameras. I am not going to give you a transcript of what she said. Plenty of words have been written down and repeated and analyzed, and none of the analysis ever quite explains why the words worked. The words themselves were not extraordinary in the sense of being uniquely well constructed. They were the words of a girl who was angry, and who was telling you exactly what she was angry about, and why she thought you should be angry too. She said she was alive, and she was in District 8, and the capital had just bombed a hospital full of people who could not move, and there would be no survivors. She said that anyone who thought a ceasefire would change what the capital was deluding themselves. She said that they could burn every district to ash, and the fire catching, and that if they burned, the capital burned with them. She believed it. This is the only thing that matters about the speech, and it is the only thing that cannot be manufactured. She was not performing conviction. She was not reading lines that had been written to produce the impression of conviction. She had just watched a building full of wounded people be bombed from the air. And she was telling you what she thought about that with her whole body, every part of her aligned behind the words, her jaw and her neck and her hands. And the way she was standing, and especially her eyes, which had a quality in that moment of being so completely present, that looking at the footage later felt like being looked at. BT cut the capital signal and replaced it with her face and her words, and pushed it across every receiver in Panem that still functioned. I watched the response come in from a seat at the back of the communications room, where I had positioned myself against the wall so as to be out of everyone's way while being in a place where I could see everything. The encrypted reports came from district contacts at intervals over the following hours. In District 7, a group of workers in the lumber industry had climbed into the canopy of their forest and detonated charges in the path of a peacekeeper patrol. In District 5, a large number of workers had moved on the hydroelectric dam that powered the capital's grid, and they had reached it, and they had destroyed significant portions of it, and the cost of reaching it had been high. In District 3, production had simply stopped. The workers had put down their tools and stood still, which is a form of action that the capital's security apparatus is not well designed to address, because you cannot arrest everyone simultaneously. In District 11, which had been under the harshest security presence of any district since the early weeks of the conflict, there was movement of a kind that the intelligence contacts described cautiously and without specifics, which sometimes means things are happening that are too large to report precisely. One person with a bow and a face that could not stop being honest, and this is what it had unlocked. I thought about that for a long time afterward, lying in my bunk in the recycled air of the underground complex. I had spent 11 years making myself invisible, which is the survival strategy available to people the powerful have decided to make into objects. I had learned to be the AVOX in the room, the furniture, the person behind the camera rather than in front of it. I had told myself that this was how you continued to exist in a system that wanted to use you, and I had been correct about that, and I had also understood for some years that being correct about it was not the same as it being sufficient. Watching her on that rooftop, I had understood something more specific. The capital had tried to do this thing to her. They had tried to make the Mockingjay into a symbol they owned, a managed and edited version of truth that they could deploy for purposes they controlled. They had failed because she was not a symbol first. She was a person first and actual, and the camera always catches actual. The war moved quickly after District 8, and the word quickly is not the right word because speed implies smoothness, and there was nothing smooth about it. It moved with the forward motion of something that has achieved its own momentum, not under anyone's full control, not proceeding according to any plan that had been written down in the command room, but driven by the accumulated pressure of everything the districts had been absorbing for 75 years. When that pressure finds an outlet, it does not flow evenly. It moves the way water moves when the structure containing it has been compromised. It finds the low places. It goes where it can go. The capital responded by escalating. They hit District 13's surface installations, which were not the operational core of the complex. The core was too deep for their ordnance to reach, but were the visible infrastructure, the supply depots and landing pads and communication towers that extended above the rock. We were below ground when the first strikes hit, deep enough that the concussions came to us as a kind of rhythmic pressure in the air, like a very large and very angry heart beating somewhere above, making the fluorescents flicker and sending small cascades of concrete dust from the ceiling joints. The alarms were a constant tone, not a fluctuating alert, but a single sustained note, which is somehow worse than a fluctuating one. We spent the worst hours in the lower bunkers. Katniss was somewhere in the complex with her family. I had met her sister only twice and briefly, but I had filed the impressions carefully. Prim was a girl of maybe 14 who had decided, very young, what kind of person she intended to be. which was the kind that helps when helping is dangerous and painful and insufficient. She had that particular quality of people who have made a genuine choice about their character, rather than just drifted into the person's circumstances made them. Clear all the way through, where most people are complicated by their own self-interest. I had watched her in the medical wing on the 2 occasions when the work had taken me through it, and I had noticed that the people she attended to were calmer after she had been with them, which is not a trivial thing to accomplish in a field hospital during a conflict. Katniss held her sister in a gray corridor through the worst of the bombing, and I know this because the corridor I was in shared a ventilation grating with theirs, and I could see them. She held her the way you hold something you have already rehearsed losing, quietly and completely, without wasted motion. When the all-clear came, and we returned to the upper levels, Katniss found the white roses, Snow's signature. He had done this before, left specific objects in specific locations as a form of communication that was also a form of threat, dressed in the aesthetic of horticulture. The roses were genetically engineered to carry a particular scent that concealed something else underneath. And they were placed where she would find them, and where no one else would initially understand what the placement meant. He was telling her that his reach was not limited by walls or distance. He was telling her that the game had parameters she did not fully understand, and that he was the one who had written them. She picked one up and looked at it for a moment, the way you look at something you have been expecting. Then she set it down. She did not say anything. She did not need to say anything. The set of her face said everything her voice would have said, and it did not say fear. The decision to go after the surviving victors, the people from previous games who had been in the arena when the rebels pulled Katniss out, who had been taken up by the Capitol rather than escaping. This decision crystallized over a week of arguments that I observed from my position as furniture in various rooms. It came from Katniss, who had made the recovery of these people the explicit condition of her continued cooperation with Coin's operation. It came from BT's intelligence team, which had developed a picture of where the victors were being held in the Capitol itself. And it came from the recognition that the Capitol's most effective current weapon was not the bombers or the peacekeepers, but the television signal, specifically the signal carrying interviews in which the boy they had taken, Peeta, the one who had survived the games beside her, the one she had been rescued while he had been left behind, in which that boy sat across from the Capitol's broadcaster and said the things that were most useful to Snow's narrative. He looked, in those broadcasts, like a man who had been shown a version of himself that did not correspond to the version he remembered, not calm. He had been coached toward calm, and the coaching was visible if you watched for it. The slight delay between question and response suggests that suggests a person checking their answer against a source. The eyes that were focused in a way that was slightly too focused. The quality of someone performing sincerity rather than feeling it. Underneath the coach calm there was something that I recognized, and that I did not have a name for, having never seen it in quite this form, but that registered as a person being held at a distance from themselves. Katniss watched those broadcasts in the same room where I was usually reviewing footage, and I watched her watching. This had become a secondary function of mine over the months in the underground. Not assigned, not requested, simply the result of the AVOX habit of observing what the room contains. What I saw when she watched him was not grief in the static sense. It was calculation behind grief. She was watching him, the way she had watched the aircraft approach, tracking the variables, solving the problem. She was also, in the gaps between work and sleep, moving through the ruins of District 12, with the camera crew on the day we traveled there to film. Heavensby's theory was that footage of the Mockingjay in the wreckage of her home would be powerful. And he was not wrong about the theory, only about what kind of power it would produce and where it would come from. District 12 had been roughly 10,000 people. The number who had gotten out was 915. The arithmetic of this was present in every direction you looked, in the absence of structure where structure had been, in the particular quality of ash over a certain depth that tells you the burning was not accidental or incidental. She walked through it with the cameras following. I watched her walk through it, and after a while she stopped in the ruins of what had been a residential area near a lake and sat down on a piece of broken wall and looked at the water. "Pollux," she said. She had been using my name for several weeks by then, had started it the day she found out I was an Avox. The day Cressida had explained what had been done to me, because she was the kind of person who, upon learning that someone had had something taken from them, immediately begins treating the absence as a matter of her personal concern. "Pollux," she said. "Can I show you something?" She whistled. 3 notes descending a specific interval, she waited. Somewhere, in what remained of the trees above the lake, one of the gray and white birds answered. Her, then another. They carry the melody you give them, and they make it back to you. Not a simple repetition, but a kind of elaboration. The original notes preserved inside something that has expanded around them. She sang for the birds, she sang for me. She was not singing for the cameras. And I know this, because I know the difference. Because I have filmed people singing for cameras and people singing because they needed to sing. And the quality is entirely different, and the camera catches it either way, but the thing it catches is not the same thing. The song was called The Hanging Tree. She had learned it from her father when she was small. It was a song about a man who had been hanged, and who was calling from the tree to the girl he loved to come join him in the dark. And the question the song never quite answers is whether the call is sinister, or whether it is simply the voice of someone who has gone ahead into a place they cannot return from, and who does not want to be alone there. I sat on broken concrete in the ash of a destroyed district, and I listened to the bird in what remained of the trees above me, picked it up note by note, interval by interval, and sent it back out into the gray sky that was the color of everything in this place. And I felt something move in my chest that I do not have a word for, because I am not someone who uses words, and the emotion did not map onto any sign I know. And it was quiet, and it was, I think, connected to the fact of having been somewhere for a long time where no one showed you the thing inside them, and then being shown it by someone who did not plan to show you and would have been surprised to know how much it mattered. Castor filmed it. From a distance, without intruding on the moment, Cressida watched the footage later and said, in a voice I had not heard from her before, a voice that was quieter than her professional voice and more uncertain, "This is the one. She was right." BD put it across every working broadcast receiver in Panem, and in the hours that followed the dam in District 5 came down. I am not making a direct causal argument. I am only noting that the timing was what it was. The blackout plan was BT's. He explained it to me one evening, in the communications room when it was just the two of us, and he was working through the details and wanted, I think, someone to explain it to, rather than just running it in his head. And he was one of the few people in 13 who treated explaining something to me as a normal activity rather than a charity. The hydroelectric facility in District 5 was the capital's primary power source, already damaged, repairable but not yet repaired. If a coordinated strike hit the right points, in the repair structure at the right time, the capital's grid would go dark, permanently. He was careful about that. The qualification was important to him, but long enough. Long enough for a small team to move through capital streets without surveillance. Long enough to reach where the victors were being held. Gale was going to lead the team going in. He was effective at this kind of operation, in the way that some people are simply effective at certain things, without apparent effort, but with underlying precision. He was also, clearly, in a particular relationship with Katniss that I observed and filed, and did not discuss with anyone. Because no one asked me, and also it was not my business. He was in love with her. She was overwhelmed by everything else she was trying to carry. These two facts existed in the same space, and the space was uncomfortable, and everyone in it was doing their best with the discomfort. I was in the communications room when the dam came down the second time. The screens from Capital Territory went dark all at once. Not gradually, not one by one, but all together, mid-transmission, the way power disappears when the source is gone. The room went quiet in the specific way of a room full of people watching a large thing happen. BT turned from his equipment and signed to me. Window open. 31 minutes estimated. The team was already in the air. There is a quality to waiting that I am familiar with from 11 years of being furniture. But this was different. The furniture waiting is the waiting of someone who has accepted that they have no agency and is simply existing in the interim. This was the waiting of a room full of people who had done everything they could do and had now come to the end of what was possible, must sit with what they had set in motion. Coin was at the front of the room with her hands flat on the table, performing patience. Katniss was not in the room. She had been asked to wait elsewhere, which was the kind of request that Coin framed as operational protocol, and that Katniss had evidently agreed to with a quality of agreement that meant she had calculated what it would cost to refuse, and decided the cost was not worth it right now. The Capitol's power came back on in 17 minutes, not 31, 17. The screens in the room lit up mid-static and cycled back to signal, and BT said something short and decisive and began working. Team was still inside the city. The surveillance grid was cycling back up. Keepers in the Capitol during a blackout and restoration situation would be at elevated alert, because that is what you do when you have lost control of a variable and then recovered it. You tighten everything around the recovery. 17 minutes of window instead of 31, and a small team of people threading through the Capitol in the restored light. I watched the feeds come back, and I watched the operators try to track what they could from the outside, which was not much. The intelligence from inside the city was fragmentary, the kind of information that arrives in pieces that do not yet assemble into a picture. I sat against my wall and I waited, and I will not tell you that I was calm because I was not calm. I was frightened in the sustained quiet way of someone who has found over the course of several months that the people they have been watching are people they care about, and who has arrived at this situation more or less without meaning to, and does not know what to do with the feeling, except to continue sitting with it. They came back. Not everyone who went, they came back. They came off the hovercraft in the underground bay, and the ones who were mobile helped the ones who were not, and the medical teams met them at the ramp, and the bay filled with the controlled motion of emergency care, which looks different from chaos, but operates at the same speed. And in the middle of all of this, I saw the boy. I had not met Peeta before any of this started. I knew him from the broadcasts. I knew what Katniss's face did when his name came up. Shape of the choice he had made in the arena. The choice that said this other person's life has value I am willing to spend something to protect. And I understood that choice in the particular way of someone who has made their own version of it, in their own circumstances, in the way that certain kinds of recognition require only shape and not identical content. The person they brought off the ramp was alive, which was the primary objective. He was ambulatory, which mattered for his prognosis. He was physically continuous, which was what the mission had gone in to assure. And his eyes were wrong. I saw it immediately. Chalali's eyes that are processing something that does not match the external environment, that are running a calculation that the visible world is not fully providing the variables for. He was looking at the bay and the people in it, and his body was reading some of them, certain ones, in a way that bodies only read things when the brain has sent a particular classification signal. Not danger in the general sense, a specific identified threat. I knew, before the moment happened, what was going to happen. Knew it. The way you know something. When you have been watching people long enough that you read the pre-movement, the set of a body before the body acts. He saw Katniss. His hands moved. Boggs and two others had him before anything worse occurred. She was pulled back simultaneously. The bay went loud. And then it was medical people and medical procedures and the controlled emergency of a situation that everyone had been partially preparing for and hoping not to need. She stood apart from the main activity afterward. I went, and I sat near her, because there was nothing else to do, and because I was not going to leave her alone in a bay full of people who were all looking somewhere else. Could not say anything to her. My particular silence is not the silence of comfort withheld, but of comfort that has no available channel. And it is one of the things I resent most about what was done to me. Not the loss of my own voice, but the moments when someone beside me needed something that only sound can carry, and I could not provide it, she said, eventually, not looking at me, but knowing I was there. Do you think it can be undone? I thought about it honestly. Thought about what I had seen in his eyes, and what I knew about what the Capitol's medical apparatus was capable of when applied to breaking rather than healing. I thought about what I knew of her, which was more than most people in the complex, and more than she probably knew was known. I raised my hands and I signed, "I don't know." She read it. She looked at my hands for a moment after the sign finished. The way you look at something that has told you exactly what you were afraid it would tell you, but that you are nonetheless grateful for, because it did not lie to you. Jaw set. Not hard, not in the clenched way of someone swallowing something down. In the quiet way of someone reaching a decision, she said, "We are going to try." I want to tell you about the days between the rescue and the moment she said those words to me, because they were not simple days, and they are part of the account. And I have been a witness to all of it, and I will not edit what I witnessed for the sake of a cleaner narrative. The boy was kept in the medical wing with the kind of supervision that is not punishment, but is the careful management of a situation that could become dangerous very quickly. I went to see him twice, because I was assigned to. Not because it was my job in any formal sense, but because he was part of what had happened. And I am constitutionally unable to leave part of what has happened unwatched. The first time I stood in the doorway for a while, he was sitting on the edge of his cot, looking at his hands. And the quality of how he was looking at his hands was the quality of someone who does not fully trust the thing they are looking at, who is watching their own hands, the way you watch an unfamiliar animal that might or might not be dangerous. The attendant who was monitoring him noticed me and I stepped back and did not go in. The second time he was awake and aware enough to look at me when I entered. I sat in the chair beside the door, and I looked at him, and he looked at me. He had not been told, apparently, what I was, because there was no particular wariness in how he looked at me. I was just another person in the complex, another gray-clothed resident of the underground, and he scanned me the way he was scanning everything, with the methodical and slightly effortful quality of a person who is trying to build a picture of their environment from scratch. He looked at my face for a while, and then he signed something, not my language, not the District 13 version, but a rough approximation of the sign for, "Can you speak?" Signed back no. He considered this, he said aloud, in a voice that was quieter than I had expected from the broadcasts. "Me neither. Not really. Not lately. I do not know what he meant precisely. I know what I think he meant. I think he meant that the voice the Capitol had given him in those broadcast interviews was not his voice in the sense that mattered, and that his actual voice, the one attached to his actual opinions and his actual memory and his actual self, was somewhere he could not currently reach. I think he meant that he was in there, the original, the person who had existed before whatever they did, and that he knew he was in there, and that the knowing was not the same as having access. I stayed for about 20 minutes. We did not talk further. I sat in the chair and he sat on his cot, and we were two people who had both had something taken by the Capitol in different ways, and who understood each other's silence in whatever approximate sense understanding is possible between strangers. When I left, he said, "Thanks for sitting here." I nodded. I went back to my work. There was a day. This was in the week after the rescue, after the medical teams had begun the careful and uncertain process of trying to figure out what had been done and whether it could be addressed. There was a day when Coyne called Katniss into a meeting that I was not invited to, but attended because I was AVOX, and AVOXs are furniture. The meeting was about the next phase of the operation. The districts that had risen were consolidating. The supply lines that the Capitol depended on were disrupted in ways that the Capitol's internal planning had not fully modeled. The tide of the thing had shifted in a way that, if you looked at the intelligence reports, was identifiable as genuine and not wishful. Coyne laid out the shape of what came next. It was a military shape. Resource allocation, tactical priorities, the management of alliances between district factions that had separate histories and separate grievances and were now being asked to work in concert. She talked about it the way she talked about everything, which was with the assumption that the logic of the plan was self-evident, and that anyone in the room who found it less than self-evident was missing something. I watched Katniss listen to this, not closely, Coin was talking primarily to Heavensby and the military commanders, and Katniss was present as the symbol that the operation had been organized around, rather than as a decision-maker, which was a distinction that Coin maintained carefully, and that Katniss had, I thought, begun to notice. Particular way she listened, not to the words Coin was saying, but to the space around the words, to what the words implied about who was making decisions, and on what basis. This was new. It was the listening of someone who has figured out that the room has a shape that is not fully visible from where they are standing, and who is beginning to map it. She did not say anything in the meeting. She asked one question at the end, a simple tactical question about the recovery timeline for the victors who had been extracted, which was a question that had an obvious personal dimension, but was framed in purely operational terms, which was itself a communication. She was learning the language of this particular kind of room. She was not fluent yet, but she was learning, which is more than most people manage when they are also carrying everything else she was carrying. After the meeting, she found me in the corridor. She said, "Do you think she knows what she's doing?" I considered this. Coin was competent. She had kept a district of people alive underground for 40 years through the application of systemic discipline. And that is a non-trivial achievement that requires a particular kind of person in charge. She was also, I had been watching her for months, which is a long time, which produces a specific kind of knowledge. She was also a person who, when she looked at Katniss, was calculating. Not warmly, not the way a person looks at a person. The way a person looks at an asset that has been difficult to manage, and that may need to be reconfigured in the next phase of the operation. I signed to her. She knows what she's doing. I'm not sure she and you want to do the same thing. Katniss looked at my hands for a moment after the sign finished. Something registered in her expression that was not surprise. More like, "Yes, that is what I thought. I wanted to know if you saw it too." She said, "Okay." She walked back toward the medical wing. I thought about that exchange for a long time afterward. I thought about what it means to give them information the infant asked for, when you know the information is going to cost them something to use. I thought about the fact that she had asked me, specifically and not Gale or Cressida, or any of the people who had more formal relationships with her. She had asked the Avox, the furniture, the person who sees everything because no one performs for furniture. I think she trusted me precisely because I could not speak, not because silence is trustworthy in itself, but because my particular silence had a source that she understood, in the way that only someone who has also had things taken from them can understand. She knew I had not chosen to be quiet. She knew what the quiet had cost. And she knew, I think, that a person who has had their voice taken and who still manages to bear witness, who still shows up, who still carries the camera, who still sits in chairs in medical wings for 20 minutes without being asked, that person is not keeping quiet out of indifference. She came back to the medical wing every day, sometimes twice a day, between the work and the briefings and the broadcasts, and the physical training that Coin's schedule required of everyone in the complex. She went and she sat with him. Most days, from what I was able to determine from the brief observations I was able to make. Most days he was uncertain of her in the way that I had seen in the bay, the threat classification at the back of his eyes. Some days were better than that. There was a morning when I was passing the corridor outside the medical wing, and I heard through the door her voice, and then his voice in response. And the rhythm of the exchange was not the rhythm of threat assessment, but the rhythm of two people talking, which is different and unmistakable, and significant enough that I stopped in the corridor for a moment before continuing to wherever I was going. Recovery, the medical people told anyone who asked, was going to be long, and not guaranteed, and required a kind of patience that is harder than anything that happens quickly. She had patience, not the easy kind, not the passive waiting for things to resolve themselves, but the active kind, the kind that involves showing up every day with no certainty that the day will be better than the day before and showing up anyway, the kind that is, in its structure, identical to everything else she did. One evening, this was late in the period I am describing, maybe a week before the rescue mission, when the operation was moving toward its final shape, and everyone in the command room had the quality of people who know they are approaching something irreversible. One evening, I was sitting in the empty broadcast room, after the day's work was finished, reviewing footage on one of the screens with the sound down, because I do not need sound and prefer the quiet, when she came in. She did not say anything at first. She sat down at the workstation beside mine, and she looked at the footage I was reviewing, which was from the District 12 visit, the footage of her walking through the ruins before she sat by the lake and sang. She watched it in the same silence I was watching it in for a while. Then she said, "Pollux." I looked at her. She said, "Do you think they're going to do something with all of this after? With what we filmed?" I thought about what she was actually asking, which was not a technical question. I signed. Someone always does something with footage. What matters is whether the footage is true. She looked at my hands. She had gotten better at reading me over the months. She said, "It's true. All of it." I signed, "I know." She was quiet for a while. Then she said, "I keep thinking about Pollux. The original, I mean, the one from the old songs, the one in the myths with his brother. They traded places, one mortal, one immortal, and the immortal one traded half his immortality so they could share it. So neither one had to be alone. I did not know this. I am from a district that did not have many myths. Perhaps we had myths, and they were taken from us like most other things," she said. "That's why Cressida named you, I think, because you share what you have." I did not know what to say to that, and could not have said it anyway. I sat with it. It was the most unexpected thing anyone had said to me in 11 years, and it was delivered in an empty broadcast room at night by a girl from a Deathworld who was 3 weeks away from a mission that might bring back the person she loved in a condition that was still unknown. I nodded. It was the only response available to me. She nodded back. She got up and went to whatever came next. That was the last conversation we had before the mission and the rescue and the aftermath. Not the last time I saw her. I saw her every day through the rest of it, through the blackout and the wait and the return and the bay. But the conversations of the kind that I am describing, the kind that happen when the cameras are off and the work is done and two people are sitting in a room together, without an agenda. Those were the conversations that I watched her have with the world, and that is the kind I am trying to record. That was the last thing she said, that I am going to put in this account. Because nothing happened after. Things happened, significant things, the kind that changed the shape of a world. But because what happened after belongs to a different telling and requires a different witness, I am the witness of this period, these particular months. And what I witnessed was this. A girl from a place the capital had decided was expendable was made into a symbol against her will and refused to be only a symbol. She was asked to perform feats she was actually having, and she would not perform them on schedule, so instead she had them in front of a camera. And it turned out that the real thing was more powerful than any performance could have been. She was bombed and buried, and had her home reduced to ash, and was handed back the person she cared most about, with something essential changed in him. And each time she absorbed the cost and continued. Not without feeling it, she felt all of it. She just refused to let the feeling be the end of the sentence. The capital had built their entire civilization on the premise that certain people could be made into objects, into labor, into spectacle, into furniture, into messages sent from the powerful to the powerless. They had built the games. They had built the AVOX program. They had built the broadcasting apparatus. And all of it rested on the assumption that the things they took from people were the things those people were. They took my tongue and assumed they had taken my voice, and they were right in the narrow literal sense, and completely wrong in the sense that matters. She was the proof of the same argument. They tried to take her, and what they got was the Mockingjay, which turned out not to be the symbol they could design and deploy, but the actual girl in front of an actual camera in a destroyed district singing a song her father taught her to a bird. That is not a symbol. That is a person. The difference is everything. I have no voice. I carry a camera. I was furniture in the capital for 11 years, and I was furniture in the communications room, and I was furniture on the rooftop in District 8, and what furniture sees is true, because no one performs for furniture. What I saw was true. I have the record. The record will outlast everything else because truth is the thing that does not require maintenance. It simply is as long as someone is watching, and the camera is running, and the footage is stored somewhere that cannot be bombed. She raised her bow, and the aircraft came down. She sang in the ruins and the birds carried it. She set her jaw and said, "We are going to try." I was there.